For a long time, I've made efforts to separate myself from the stereotypically far left position of condemning voting. I've admitted that voting doesn't take long, it's fine to encourage somebody to vote who might not otherwise, and that generally there is a meaningful difference between the two major parties in the US and the UK. My skepticism around voting has come from the inclination of various leftists to put their full organizational weight behind liberal candidates like Biden or Stanmer, and end up being subsumed into these parties that hate us and our beliefs and leave our own goals unpursued. Ultimately, though, I'm still arguing for a position of balance rather than outright condemnation. That being said, I believe recent developments have left this analysis obsolete, and that radicalism must now take a much more ruthless position to keep up with the changing consciousness of the wider public. The ongoing genocide in Gaza has led to a noticeable shift in attitudes in liberals and leftists alike across the West. We've had to watch as our political leaders march lockstep with Israel's brazen attempts to displace Palestinian people with no outlet for resistance in conventional politics. And then with the elections in the US and the UK coming up this year, this is naturally leading people to question whether or not these genocide enablers even deserve our votes to begin with. And then from there, especially in the US, you've had the typical discourses of harm reduction and lesser evil voting spin up too. Today then, I want to make the case explicitly against voting as the strongest strategy that the left currently has available. Now, because my usual video production process apparently takes months or even years now, I'm slapping this together at a much lower production quality, just so I can get it out while it still has some relevancy. For anyone wondering, I am also working on a much longer, much fancier video on the side, but that's still a bit off from here. So. I just realized my neck is purple because my floor LED is on and it's too late to turn it off, so if you're wondering, I'm not diseased, that's just why. So the key observation of the current moment is that the rejection to vote is the most effective path towards radicalization. Due to being presented a choice between different genocide enablers, a shift in attitude against voting has taken place for many younger liberals and leftists alike, with the previously unthinkable of not voting for anybody being taken seriously. What's special about this is that not voting is a fundamentally illogical, nonsensical position, yet despite this, people are being drawn to it anyway. This is because, in a political landscape such as ours, still mired in capitalist realism, where alternatives can scarcely be imagined, let alone be made feasible, resistance can often manifest as a desire to reject society altogether. In a sense, the only response to a world in which revolution or even reform feel hopelessly out of grasp is to simply declare, I cannot imagine a new future, but I don't need one to reject the present existence anyway. The urge not to vote is one such instance of a blind resistance. The desire to escape the perpetual dilemma of lesser evilism by rejecting its premise outright. This desire is, again, raw, it's base, it's unrefined, it's often ill thought out, but this is exactly what defines it as a complete rejection of existing society. Because in rejecting these systems, we also reject their rules, their internal logic, and their entire framework of what makes sense. While those who subscribe to the logic of existing superstructures, our political systems and the electoral process, will insist on how simple and obvious just voting is, that can't change the fact that the desire not to vote is a seed by which a radical desire to change society can grow. Once this rejection bursts to the surface, an incredibly effective path to radicalize these people is to take those base feelings and turn them into a cohesive political worldview. This plays on the same dynamic we saw in 2020 over abolishing the police. An at the time immediately intuitive idea that cleared the way to radical thinking, yet also made no sense within the framework of existing society. And today, this type of demand takes the form of something far simpler, of not having to support genocide. What threatens this budding radicalism is that it must immediately clash against the facts and logic of existing society, which demands that these alternatives are born fully formed and able to meet standards which they're trying to move past to begin with. If we don't vote for the Democrats, how will we beat the Republicans? If we don't have the police, how will we prevent crime? It's the job of superstructures like the media and the political system to forcibly drag these intuitive desires down into the mud of policy and electoral pragmatism, where they lose any radical potential. This was the fate of abolishing the police the moment it became defund the police, which, ironically enough, in trading in its radical content to be more appealing to conventional politics, did a far worse job at grasping anybody as a position than abolition ever did. Voting is especially vulnerable to this, because its radical content consists of simply not engaging with a system at all, with no immediately obvious alternate mode of activity. Of course, in reality, no longer allowing ourselves to be tied up in the spectacle of electoral politics frees us up to do all sorts of things, but this won't be immediately obvious to most people who begin to question the basis of voting, and they'll be continually beat over the head with the idea that it just takes a day to vote. We can postulate about various forms of direct action, mutual aid, and activism in general we can get involved with instead of party politics. It is unequivocal that the most impact that anybody in the West can have on the Gaza genocide is trying to prevent shipments from reaching Israel, as has already been done in the form of strikes and direct action. But what has decisively changed about this analysis is that we're no longer trying to propose just a better way to organize. The focus is now on an amplified potential for radicalization. However, the crucial element of this particular shift in the political moment is that it tears open a deep schism in the current left. The position, at least in theory, for the harm reduction left was that we could support lesser evil candidates while at the same time building a radical movement of our own. The situation at hand undoes this excuse though, because now the two goals are explicitly opposed. The task of a left concerned with winning elections is now to squash this sense of anti-electoralism and any radicalism that comes with it. The line of electoral leftists today is to play our society's superstructures, to correct these raw desires to escape the present moment back into current society, into lesser evilism. To be explicit, it is to play the role of the reactionary. As such, any leftist who has invested in the short-term opportunism of electoralism now has a choice to make. To either shift focus to where radical potential really exists, or to forsake radicalism and fully submit oneself to their role as the left of bourgeois society. Meanwhile, the task of a left concerned with building radicalism is to explicitly encourage the feeling to reject voting, and nurture it into an established political worldview. Let's be clear quickly though, there isn't some principled stance here against the act of voting itself, like is often found among, for instance, anarchists. The physical act of casting a ballot literally does not matter, so if you feel more comfortable voting anyway, then please, go nuts. The key is allowing and encouraging people to explore the idea of not voting, and how we might engage in politics otherwise, such that we open the way to new forms of thinking. Now, the obvious objection from here is that this is done at the risk of letting Trump win, and there is no way around this. But what is failed to be grasped is that this is simultaneously the strongest strategy in fighting Trump and far-right populism in general. Now, let's be clear, this isn't an accelerationist position. The goal is not to make Trump win, and the idea is not that his winning would improve anything. Rather, it's recognizing that lesser evil voting is a pathetically ineffective strategy at fighting the far right. And I would go as far to say that anybody who dedicates themselves to it at the expense of everything else is more responsible for Trump than anyone who would forgo voting for the sake of building radicalism. Even without looking at history, this should be self-evident by the fact that Biden was voted in as a safe, middle-of-the-road establishment candidate just to get Trump out, and now a single term later is running the risk of losing to Trump again. Consider as well that the whole time Biden has been in, Republican states such as Florida have only spiraled further into quasi-fascism at a seemingly faster rate than ever. Pushing all weight behind Biden again does not make Trump and the far right go away. Rather, it allows them to fester for another term and then come back the next election cycle even stronger. And so, if you remain tied to lesser evil voting out of a belief that anything else is simply impossible, it is your duty to be rushing to make it possible when the material conditions provide an opportunity like the one presented to us right now. All that's being done instead is propping up a liberalism which fascism feeds off of, and so eventually they will win if this is all we can do. If it's not over Gaza today, it'll be over something else tomorrow. And when they inevitably do win, don't you think it would be important to have a pre-existing group of radicals that are able to actually kick into action and help those who are going to suffer the most under this far-right government? Even today, the marginalized living under Republican states are far more likely to be aided by local groups of communists than anybody else. And again, even today, the only way to effectively help Gaza is to try and prevent shipments from reaching Israel. Like I said, this is already being attempted, but it hasn't been strong enough to deliver results just yet. Efforts so far are being easily co-opted and pacified by career activists. But imagine what could be done if, instead of supporting the Dems and arguing over whether or not we're obligated to vote for them, we poured our energy into these forms of resistance instead. Even from an electoralist perspective, there's value in rejecting voting today for the sake of pushing people left, to increase the possibility in the future of a left populist candidate becoming viable who could actually maintain a victory over the far right. These candidates don't just materialize out of thin air after you've waited long enough. They grow out of the pre-existing political landscape, and they're far more likely to gain traction under one full of people so radical they wouldn't even entertain the notion of voting for a genocide enabler. One might suggest that we might not be able to build a radical movement strong or large enough to actually affect the difference needed here, be it in direct action or in pushing for a Bernie 2028 run. But if this is the case, then we also haven't convinced enough people away from voting to meaningfully affect the result of the election. So that's my pitch to not vote in 2024. I know I pretty much just spoke about the US today, but if you're in the UK, you already know that everyone already agrees Labour is as bad, if not maybe worse, than the Conservatives, especially if you're trans. So I didn't think it was really worth talking about that. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, I do have something longer and more fleshed out and edited and blah 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 coming out hopefully in a month or two, so stick around for that. But either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see all you lovely people again hopefully soon. Bye.